Let's practice this process of vertical summation for a non-rival good. It says complete the table below and determine the optimal level of this good, assuming it costs $19 per hour to hire a security guard. So instead of graphs here, we have the demand schedules. We have the price per hour, quantity that Joe will demand, and then similarly for Jill. What we're going to do here is we are going to construct our schedule for the market demand. Now recall from the prior lesson that we use vertical summation. Why? Because Joe and Jill are enjoying a non-rival good, security guard services. As long as there's a security guard in the mall, then both Joe and Jill as business owners can simultaneously feel more secure. So to do this, we use vertical summation at each quantity. For example, the first hour of protection is valued by Joe at $18. It's valued by Jill at $20. So 38 would be the first point on our demand, on our market demand curve. And then the second hour, looks like Joe values it at 16 and Jill values it at 18. So 18 plus 16 is going to be 34. 34 hours for the second one. Okay. And then maybe I can draw some lines here to distinguish it. Then the third hour is going to be, for Joe, it's going to be valued at 14. And then for Jill, it's going to be valued at 16. So that's going to be 30. And then the fourth hour is going to be 12 for Joe and 14 for Jill. So that's 26. Fifth hour, 10 for Joe, 12 for Jill, 22. Sixth hour, 8 for Jill. Sixth hour, 10 for Jill. So 18. Seventh hour, 6 for Joe. 8 for Jill. 14. Eighth hour, 4 for Joe. 6 for Jill. 10. And then finally the ninth hour, 2 for Joe, 4 for Jill, so 6. So now we have our demand schedule for this security guard protection. It says up here though, assume it costs $19 to hire a security guard. Well, how many hours should be hired? Well, if the cost is $19 an hour, we would definitely want to do the first hour because we value it collectively at $38. Looks like the second hour would be good, third hour, fourth hour, fifth hour. The sixth hour, though, we would not want. So we would actually do 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, but not the sixth. Why? Because if the cost is $19 an hour, we don't want to take $19 an hour to get $18 an hour in value. So we would stop at 5. This would be the optimal allocation of security guard protection in the mall where Jill and Joe own their businesses. But remember, this is a non-rival good. And sometimes with non-rival goods, we don't get the most efficient outcome. Why? Well, take a look. Notice that if Joe is the one that's going to consider purchasing security guards, at $19 an hour, he will not even hire one security guard. He would pay $19 on his own. He would pay $19 per hour to get $18 in value for the first hour. He's not going to throw $19 at $18 value. So Joe chooses 0, left to his own devices. Jill, on the other hand, Jill values the first hour at 20. So she would definitely pay $19 to get $20 of protection, but she wouldn't go to a second hour. So in this situation, if Jill makes her own decisions and Joe makes his own decisions, the result is we will get 1 hour of security protection in this mall. Of course, Jill's going to resent Joe because she's going to pay $19 to get 1 hour of security protection and watch Joe benefit by $18. This is an example of a public good, with essentially security being a proxy for national defense. It's non-rival, both can benefit simultaneously, and it's non-excludable. If Jill buys it, she can't prevent Joe from benefiting from it. So it fits the public good problem we talked about before. How do you deal with a public good? Well, you're going to get in the marketplace an underallocation, as we just illustrated here. So you create government to correct this. What does government really look like in this sense? Well, it's where Jill and Joe come together and recognize that there is a collective demand through vertical summation that can get them a overall better outcome than they would operating independent of each other. And that's where we see the creation of government to fix the problem of the public good, the underallocation of security guard protection in this mall. Now let's revisit the common resource and talk about the tragedy of the commons. Recall that a common resource occurs when the resource is rival but non-excludable. Lumberjacks and fishermen and poachers can go out into nature and they can take what they want because there's no way to prevent them from getting those resources. But there is a cost to society because fish, timber, and other wildlife are rival. They get them, we don't. As a result, this creates an over-allocation of resources in the free market towards goods that use these resources. This is actually just another way of looking at something we studied in a prior lesson, the externality of external costs. We did it for electricity, but let's now do it for cords of wood. On the horizontal axis, we have the lumberjack producing wood. And on the vertical axis, we have the costs and benefits as usual. Demand curve, be the people that benefit from the wood. And then the supply curve, which is the marginal cost curve. That's the cost of producing the wood. Problem is, the lumberjack sees a cost curve that is actually lower than the true social cost, because he's taking the trees out of the forest, and again, he's paying for wages and fuel and so on and so forth, but he's not paying for the trees themselves. And therefore, we get a private cost that is reduced, lower than the true social cost. That creates a market equilibrium, identified here as actual output, that is higher than the efficient equilibrium, identified here as the efficient output. This becomes the cost that is seen by the individual tree cutters, but this is the true cost of cutting the tree. And this means that we get a deadweight loss. These units from efficient to actual have a social cost greater than the social benefit. But the tree cutter doesn't see the social cost. They see the private cost. So between efficient and actual, they see costs here and benefit here. They see this area here as a net gain. But society sees this area here, the yellow shaded area, as a deadweight loss. We don't want to allocate resources towards a production of goods where the social cost is greater than the social benefit. But the individual companies don't see the social cost, so they take us there. How do you fix this? One way is to enforce property rights. That is, take what is non-excludable, like a forest, and make it excludable by putting a fence around it and charging these lumberjacks for the trees they cut down. The problem is This may be unrealistic if you're in a large common area. You can't very well put a fence around a forest, and it's very difficult to police an ocean. In smaller communities, you might be able to use norms and values to prevent this over-extraction of resources, teaching people to take only what they need from nature. Recognize that if something is scarce by nature, to protect it, preserve it. Examples of this include, say, white tigers or white elephants. They're so rare that it would be highly offensive in some communities to slaughter such an animal. Then there's taxes, quotas, and tradable permits. This is where we usually end up with the common resources in large communities. If you can't enforce property rights because it's too large an area and the community is not small enough to really be driven by culture, then you need to have government incentives. So in this case, we would tax the lumberjack for the wood that he takes down, essentially raising his private costs as close to the social costs as possible. Quotas could just be to limit the amount of wood that he can take, such as licensing people to cut down a certain amount of trees. We do this with animals, with deer licenses and so forth, where you can only shoot a certain amount of them in a given season. And then tradable permits. With tradable permits, you allow the lumberjack to go out and cut down wood or take the tradable permit and sell it to someone else that can go and cut down the wood. But we would limit the amount of tradable permits to what we deem efficient to prevent the market failure.